Good morning, everybody. It is great to be here. It's such an honor. Like Liz, I spent pretty much the last decade of my life at Duke, had lots of wonderful opportunities to work at the Lemur Center, and I've only very recently moved away, so it's just a wonderful homecoming to be back here and celebrating the Lemur Center, which, as Liz said, was just one of the most remarkable things about being at Duke for me, and to have an opportunity to celebrate these incredible animals. So my talk is Lemur Diversity is a Natural Experiment in Cognitive Evolution. And just to give you a little bit of background about my research program, my research is really broadly motivated by questions about how and why cognition evolves. And our approach to thinking about these questions is a fundamentally comparative one. So we study the minds of diverse animal species, trying to identify biological and ecological predictors of species differences in different aspects of cognition. And some of the most powerful opportunities that we have for getting insights into these questions about how and why cognition evolves come from situations where we can observe convergent evolution, specifically where we see similar cognitive traits in distantly related species and in scenarios where it's unlikely that these similarities result from a homologous mechanism. And also these interesting scenarios of divergence, where we have a group of closely related species that vary in some aspects of their cognition. So really the ideal sort of scenario from this divergence model, if we were to set up a perfect experiment, what we would do is we would have a group of close genetic relatives that have evolved to occupy a wide range of diverse ecological niches. So I hope the setup here is fairly obvious in that this is lemurs. Lemurs are absolutely extraordinary and perfect for these kinds of questions. So these are a group of animals that have evolved to inhabit an incredibly diverse range of habitats and environments across the island of Madagascar. Incredibly different ecologies, animals that make a living finding and feeding on different kinds of food, and animals that are characterized by tremendous diversity in terms of their social systems as well. So today I'm going to be talking about studies looking at variants in lemur social systems as they relate to species differences in cognition. But I just want to underscore this point that actually the range of diversity that we see in lemurs makes lemurs just an incredible group for asking all kinds of questions about how and why different aspects of cognition might evolve. And we'll be very lucky in that later in the presentation we'll hear more about other aspects of lemur ecology as they relate to cognition. So why social systems, and why would we focus on this particular set of questions? And for me, these are ideas that actually trace origins back to early work with lemurs in the 1960s and subsequent work in the 1970s. But I think we should pay homage to two critical people who really set the stage for this kind of thinking. And the first was Alison Jolly, who went to Madagascar in the 1960s and came back and published a paper in Science describing her early efforts. And I just want to pull out two quotes from this article that I think were provocative at the time and are still provocative for many people today. So she says in describing her initial trip here, she says, "I went to Madagascar with two main questions. How much do these lemur societies resemble the troops of other primates? And what bearing has primate social behavior on the evolution of intelligence?" So after about a year in the field, she reports on her sort of preliminary results, and she says that lemurs seem to have monkey-type societies without having evolved monkey-level intelligence. And from this, she goes on to speculate that social life probably preceded and in fact determined the nature of primate intelligence. So I think really a very prescient idea from the 1960s. About a decade later, Nick Humphrey wrote another now seminal paper called The Social Function of Intellect. And basically in this paper, he argues that probably some of the greatest challenges, the cognitive challenges that primates face arise just as a function of living in complex societies. And so just to pull a little bit from this paper as well, Humphrey says, social primates are required by the very nature of the system they create and maintain to be calculating beings. In such a situation, social skill goes hand in hand with intellect, and the intellectual faculties required are of the highest order. And so from this, he goes on to predict that actually if we look at variance in cognition across species, he says his thesis demands that there should be a positive correlation across species between social complexity and intelligence. Okay, so you have these two early thinkers that are basically arguing that many of the cognitive challenges that primates face and many of the things that may have been important in primate cognitive evolution are in the social domain. So what kinds of problems does the social domain actually impose on animals? And there are many, and I'm not going to pretend to even try to touch on all of them today, but I'll tell you about two different kinds of problems that we've thought about. So the first of these is that animals in social groups, one of the big challenges they face is actually figuring out the nature of relationships between other individuals in a group. And just to give you an example of the sort of complexity that can arise from this, well, if you have a group of just 25 animals, if I've done my math correctly, and I probably haven't, but I think there are 300 unique pairwise relationships. So if you're in a group of 25 animals and you have to figure out what's going on in 300 different dyadic context, that's something that could be incredibly computationally expensive. But there are cognitive shortcuts that animals could use to help them solve these problems. And one of these shortcuts would be a process like transitive inference. So transitive inference is this basic idea that if you know, for example, that animal A is dominant to animal B and that animal B is dominant to animal C, then you might be able to make the inference that animal A is dominant to animal C without ever having any direct information about the interaction between those individuals. And so we were, in studies that were conducted collaboratively with Liz, we were inspired by some early papers, actually bird people who are always ahead of the primate people in asking these interesting questions. We were inspired by studies with corvids that showed a species difference between a corvid species that lived in really large social groups and a corvid species that lived in small social groups, and showed differences in their ability to solve different kinds of transitive problems. So this was one of the first comparative questions that we wanted to look at in lemurs. And so for these studies, we tried to choose lemur species that really contrasted in terms of their social organization. And so we picked lemur cata, who live in the largest social groups of any lemur species, and we compared them to mongoose lemurs, who live in smaller family groups with less strict dominance hierarchies than those in ringtail lemurs. So to test lemurs for transitive inference, we used a computer touchscreen paradigm very similar to what Liz just showed you. But instead of using something like numerical stimuli, we used an arbitrary series of images. So we pulled these 7 black and white pictures here, and just as a side note, it actually turned out to be very important to choose high contrast black and white images to get these kinds of discriminations going. So there were lots of things we had to learn about lemurs on the way. We had to both get them up off the ground, we had to use high contrast black and white images, and I think after we got over some of these hurdles, we could really start asking a lot of questions of lemurs in new ways. But so we use these black and white images, and basically we arbitrarily assigned ranks to the images. So that, for example, here, this would be the highest ranked image in the series, and the dots here on the right would be the lowest ranked image in the series. And what we would do to train lemurs about this sequence is we would present them with pairs of stimuli that were adjacent to one another in the sequence. And lemurs would be rewarded for choosing the higher ranked of those two stimuli. So if the sequence at the top here is the one that we're using, and we presented lemurs with a choice between the picture with the star here and the picture with the stripes, in this instance, they would be rewarded for choosing the star picture. But in another problem, if they were shown a picture of the stripes here and the dreadlocks, in that situation, they would be rewarded for choosing the stripes. So it was basically a conditional discrimination of these pairwise relationships. So after lemurs were trained with this, what we could then do is we could test them on with pairs of stimuli that they'd never actually seen or been trained with before, that were further apart from one another in this sequence. So in this example test here, if we tested them with the image of the star and the image of the dreadlocks, the question is, can they infer that the star is higher in the sequence than the picture of the dreadlocks? So I'll show you a quick video of what this looks like. I think it's a lot of fun to watch lemurs work on this problem. You can go ahead and cue the video. I love most about doing this kind of work with lemurs is you can actually see the mental comparisons going on as they do this. Because they're using their nose more than their hand, they're not back from the screen. You can actually sort of see this back and forth looking behavior as they're making these comparisons on every trial. Okay. So what do we find here? Well, if we look at performance with the basic premise information, training on these adjacent items in the sequence, what we see is that ringtail lemurs and mongoose lemurs are very similar. And I should tell you that this is training that takes a long time. This is after about 300 sessions of training to learn all of these different pairwise relationships. But at the end of that training phase, the two species are fundamentally similar. Now, interestingly, when we present them with these test pairs, these tests of transitive inference, we see a really interesting species difference here, and one that aligns with the predictions of this social complexity hypothesis. So specifically, ringtail lemurs here are scoring much higher on these tests of transitive reasoning than are the mongoose lemurs. And so Liz talked a little bit about distance effects. Another kind of question that we wanted to look at in exploring these data was, well, if lemurs are really representing these stimuli along some underlying sequence, we should expect that we would see better discrimination between pairs of items that are further apart in this sequence. So I'll give you just Liz talked about this with number, but just to give you a quick example with a non-numeric thing, if I were to ask you which letter comes first in the alphabet and I gave you the comparison of F versus Y or F versus H, most of you would be much quicker and much more accurate in this F versus Y comparison than the F versus H comparison. And we can think about distance effects with a sequence like this in the same way. So if we say that items that are next to one another in this series have a distance of 1, items that have one intervening item between them have a distance of 2, so on and so forth. And basically, we should expect better and faster discrimination between stimuli that are further apart in the sequence. And that's exactly what we found with ringtail lemurs here. So what I'm plotting is basically the distance between pairs of stimuli in the sequence and then their accuracy at responding to those pairs. So in ringtail lemurs, they get better. They show this distance effect, whereas we don't see that pattern in mongoose lemurs. So what is it that actually differs between the species? And is this a difference in their ability to make transitive inferences? And initially, that was a very tempting conclusion. But we did the thing that we always do, which is we go collect more data, and then it tells us that we were wrong, and we have to think about something else. So the data that we went on to collect is that we retrained these same animals in a paradigm where we basically tried to really emphasize the underlying linearity of the sequence. So for example, we trained them with just the A-B pair of the sequence, immediately followed by just the BC pair, followed by the CD pair. We did this in a way that really made it clear that there was an underlying linear sequence here. And what we find in that situation is that then when we test those animals for transitive inference, the species differences completely disappear, and we get very similar findings in both species. So the conclusion that I'm tempted to draw from this is that what differs between these species is not a fundamental ability to make transitive inferences, but actually an ability to sort of infer that underlying linear hierarchy in the first place. And the critical thing is that ringtail lemurs seem to be doing this even when they get presented with information about the relationships between pairs in this sequence in a very sort of piecemeal way. And probably that's quite analogous to the way that animals get confronted with information about dominance in their real lives. So it would be very unusual that if you were observing dominance encounters, you would always see animal A dominate animal B immediately followed by animal B dominating animal C. You'd be seeing lots of different interactions in different orders, and it would sort of be up to you to piece this together in a meaningful way. So we think that may be the interesting difference that we're looking at here. So I'll tell you now about a second set of studies looking at another aspect of social cognition that we think would be important for group living species, and this is visual perspective taking. Brian talked a little bit about this, but basically, again, the idea of being able to make inferences about what others can and can't see, or to be able to determine when someone is or isn't watching. And in this study, we used a larger comparative sample. So we had 6 different lemur species, again represented by a diversity of social systems. So in the largest social groups, we again had ringtail lemurs and mongoose lemurs living in the smallest groups of this sample. But we had 4 other species with sort of intermediate-sized species-typical social groups here. And the task that we used here is a food stealing paradigm. We basically asked the question of whether lemurs would strategically pilfer food that a competitor could not see. So in this situation, the competitor is not another lemur, it's actually a human. So the first thing that we had to do was to teach lemurs that humans could be competitors. They have to get out of this habit of learning about the DLC technicians as being these nice, wonderful people that are always giving them grapes, to suddenly dealing with researchers who are now going to steal food from them. So the way that we do this is we set you're basically looking at this from the lemur's point of view. So the lemur is up on a platform, and we create the situation where there's two grapes at the end of the table here, and we have a person sitting behind one of them, whereas the other one is out there kind of on its own. And lemurs are allowed to go take this uncontested piece of food. That's no problem. They can go get it. But if they approach the piece of food near Joel Bray here, he's going to grab this food and take it away from the lemur before they get a chance to eat it. So after we introduce them to this problem, they meet a criterion. They're successfully avoiding the human. They sort of know that the human will take the food away. Then what we can do is present them with a series of test trials where in these situations there's actually two people present, and they're equidistant from the food items, but in each situation one of these people can see the food and they can see the lemur approaching, whereas the other is oriented away and can't see the lemur and the food. So in one condition here we have one person who's facing forward, the other person has their back turned. We have a condition where both people are facing sideways, but one person is looking in towards the food, whereas the other person is looking away from the food. And then last, we have this very subtle condition where both people are facing forward, but one person is wearing a headband over their eyes so they can't see. Superficially similar, another person is wearing a headband, but they're wearing it over their mouth. So obviously this has no effect on their vision. So I'll again show you another quick video of what this looks like. You can go ahead and cue that. So they get familiar with sees Joel's beautiful mug and he decides that that's probably not where it's going to go. The video cut. There should be more. I can't even see. The other is facing away. So what do we find here? Well, before I tell you anything about species differences, let's just generally ask, is this the kind of discrimination that lemurs make? There have been nice studies with apes and with monkeys showing that actually these animals seem to solve these problems relatively flexibly. So do lemurs make similar discriminations? And the answer is, for the most part, yes. So if we present them with the situation where it's a person who's facing forward versus backwards, they're very good at making that discrimination. Same with this profile condition where it's just which direction the person is looking. But however, the condition with the headband over the eyes and mouth is something that lemurs don't really seem to be discriminating here. And in some ways that's unsurprising. This has been a very challenging thing for chimpanzees and bonobos and old world monkeys as well. But there is diversity here in the species. There are species differences. So if we look at the relationship between the typical size of the social group that these animals live in and performance on these tasks, what we see is that actually there's a very nice positive correlation between overall scores in this paradigm and the typical social group sizes of these species in nature. If we look at this in each of the different conditions here, in the front versus back condition, we have pretty much the strongest finding here, where it looks like basically there's a linear relationship between group size and performance in this context. We have some evidence for a positive association in the profile condition, and then in this last condition, there's really no relationship, but this is a problem that lemurs aren't solving as a group above chance anyway. Interestingly, though, I will say that the chafox were the only species that did seem to make this headband over the eyes versus mouth discrimination. I don't know why. I still don't have an explanation. If anybody does, please come talk to me at the break. I'd like to learn about that. So one of the questions that this immediately raised for us then is, well, is this a general phenomenon? Do lemurs that live in large social groups, are they good at solving cognitive problems in any domain? Can we make some blanket statement that these social animals are smarter in some way? So to look at this, we tested lemurs in a non-social task as well, the same species here. Brian's talked a little bit about this task, so I won't go into it in detail. It's this inhibitory control task. So again, very simply, in the warm-up, they learn to retrieve the food from within the opaque cylinder. And then in the test, we use the transparent cylinder, so they see the food right in front of their face, and they have to put the brakes on this reaching response. Brian showed you a nice video, but just, this is only 10 seconds, so you can go ahead and play it because it's always fun to watch. So, and actually, I think, Ryan mentioned that Shafoks are not terribly visual creatures, but Matilda in this situation is really being a little bit too visual. So what do we find in this context? Well, in this situation, actually, there's no relationship between social group size and performance on this task. And as Brian mentioned, this is based on these preliminary results, we were able to build this sample up to include 36 species, and that's the same phenomena that we have observed in a much larger sample. So really, based on initial work with lemurs and using some of these tests suggest that yes, these are valid cognitive measures that can be implemented with species with different morphology, different feeding habits. That was the inspiration for this kind of work, and I think there are many other lemur studies that we've done that I hope will also get us some traction on much larger comparative studies, and lemurs have just been critical here. So I started the talk by talking about some of these critical ideas put forth by Jolly and Humphrey. So were they right? And I think that for the most part, the answer is a resounding yes. But I think there are some important caveats and things that we've learned as well. So I just want to highlight those. So in terms of Alison Jolly's ideas, she presented this idea that living in social environments was probably critical in primate cognitive evolution. I think that's almost certainly the case. Interestingly, where I think she may have been a little bit premature is in concluding that lemurs that live in these large social groups actually do lack monkey-like intelligence. And one of the ways that we would interpret these data are that highly social lemur species like the ringtail lemur may actually be cognitively convergent with haplorhine primates. So probably some aspects of cognition and social living do go hand in hand, but I don't think that, I think cognition is keeping up with social living in very much in real evolutionary time. Nick Humphrey had this nice idea that we should see a positive correlation between the size of the groups that animals live in and some cognitive measures. I've presented some nice data to suggest that's the case, but I think there's a little bit of nuance we have to add here in that that's probably not something that's going to hold true for all different measures of cognition, and probably these are going to be domain-specific kinds of relationships. So social animals will be good at solving certain kinds of social problems, but this may not change the way that they solve other cognitive problems at all. So for example, we see no relationship with something like social group size. So just to, regardless of sort of how you interpret these data and what the takeaway is, the one thing that I would want to leave you with today is the idea that lemurs, and especially the Duke Lemur Center, have just been absolutely central in helping us test some of these hypotheses about how cognition evolves, and we are very lucky and deeply grateful to have had those opportunities. So thank you.